Hello, and welcome to the webinar for Chapter 1, Statistics Solutions. Just a couple notes before we get started. Everyone will get a copy of the presentation, the entire presentation, including the slides and the vocal components. Also, you are welcome to ask questions, to type questions in as we proceed, but I won't get around to answering them until the end. Okay, all right, onward. Chapter 1. First thing I want to say, and I'll emphasize this all the way through, is you always want to be sure to follow your school's template. Most schools have templates or guidelines for their chapters. Some schools don't. So something like this will act as a general guide for you to use. But most schools do have guidelines or templates. Now the components are pretty typical across schools, but there are, schools do have differences. Sometimes the structure, sometimes, they call sections different things. So, always follow your school's template and guidelines. Okay, so Chapter 1, it's the introduction to the study or to your dissertation, but you also want to think about the chapter as a blueprint. Okay, it tells the reader what your study is about, why you're conducting the study, and how you're going to do it. Right, and then in the later chapters, you'll get into more detail. Chapter 2 is usually the literature review. Chapter 3 usually involves the methodology. 4 is the results, and 5 is the discussion. So this kind of lays everything out, what you're doing, why you're doing, how you're going to do it. So think of it as a kind of a blueprint. And here are the sections we're going to cover today. And we're not going into depth today. This is primarily focused on the non-methods sections of Chapter 1. We do run webinars, presentations specifically on the methodological sections, like research questions and hypotheses. So if you're interested in that, at a later date, we encourage you to sign up for one of those webinars. But this will include what you see here: introduction, background, research problem, purpose, theoretical framework, definitions, significance, some of the other sections that I've kind of lumped together because some schools require them, some schools don't, and the summary. Okay, the introduction to the Chapter 1, introduction. Introduce and describe the topic of your study. Now, this is going to be an overview. You're going to get into more details as you go into the chapter. So this includes the social or the organizational problem. Your research problem will be kind of based on some kind of other problem. It could be, like I said, an organizational problem, a social problem, attrition with special education teachers, for example, an organizational problem. So, put that out front. What the problem is that you're going to be focusing on. Use statistics or supported, some kind of academic, scholarly, peer-reviewed source observation to get the reader's attention about the severity of the problem. Introduce the research problem. Now, we have a social or an organizational problem, and then there will usually be research on it, or there might not be, or there may be very little research on it, or there will be research from using a certain approach, but not other approaches. So there's usually some issue in the research. That's what the research problem is. It's usually a gap. It can be a gap, like there's no research on something, or it can be there's only a certain kind of research and we need a different kind of research. So introduce what the research problem is too. Now, all this is the introduction. You'll have this stuff worked out later. This is just kind of introducing it at the beginning. What is the issue in the research or the gap? Why is the study needed? State what is needed to address the research problem. In other words, there's a gap or some kind of issue in the research based on the problem that you have identified, the social or organizational problem. And therefore, your study is designed to address that research gap or address that research problem. So state how specifically your study is designed to do that. So at the end of this section, which isn't very long, maybe a couple pages at the most, your reader should understand what you're studying and why you're going to study it, just in broad strokes. Another thing, just a kind of a sidebar here, another thing I also recommend is, as well as getting, using your school's guidelines or template, it's always good to get an example of an approved dissertation from your school in your area to look at to see how people have handled these sections, because it's one thing to kind of read about them and to attend webinars, all very helpful, but when you're sitting down to draft, it's always helpful to have a sample or two at hand that you can see how people have kind of the actual moves that they've made in their writing to handle these sections. Usually there's a background section, and this is going to be the background, on the problem and on the research problem. So if we have let's just stick with the example of attrition and special education teachers, there will be research on that topic. Because there is, people, if it's a problem, people have researched it. So what you want to do is kind of give a summary of, or kind of sketch the development of the problem and how people have responded to the problem through research. So some of the major trends in the research on the topic. Review the research on the problem to date. Again, some of the major trends. So what do we know about the topic already? What have people done already? And what this will do is will show us, or show the reader, the research that's been conducted on the topic, and therefore what hasn't been conducted, and the gap or the problem and the need for your study. So that's kind of the idea of the background, to summarize previous research on the topic, to show what's been done, and also show what hasn't been done and what's still needed, and to funnel down to the need for your study, which funnels us and takes us to the research problem, which kind of transitions from the background. And it's a little bit more of a targeted overview of the research on the topic. Here's specifically what people have done. Here's specifically what we know, but yet here's specifically what has not been done. Here's specifically what we don't know. And it states that your research, your study is designed to fill that gap or to address that research problem. The purpose is usually stated very specifically, and I've given you an example of the actual as the presentation started. Yes. Melissa, can you hear me?
I can hear you. I'll respond to these people and help them get going.
Okay. All right. Thanks. All right. Okay. Moving on. I'm sorry, I had a little technical difficulties there. The purpose statement is usually phrased very specifically, and I've given you the example here. So the first sentence of the purpose statement section should be the actual purpose statement. And it should be phrased as the purpose of this approach and then design study is to examine, explore whatever specifically you're doing, and then the specific variables or concepts that are specific to your study and whatever specific sample or setting. So here's a quantitative example I have here. The purpose of this quantitative correlational study approach design is to examine the relationship between transformational leadership and emotional intelligence in a sample of whoever it would be, your specific sample would be. Qualitative example, very much the same. Some of the details are changed. The purpose of this generic qualitative study is to explore the challenges of African American women as they advance to positions as university presidents in, and again, your specific sample and population. The rest of the section may include specific information about the variables, major concepts, or instruments that you're going to use to measure if you're doing a quantitative. Okay, the RQs, again, this is not, this webinar doesn't focus on the methodological components of the chapter, so your RQs will need to be included at this point. Again, check with our methodological webinars for one on RQs and hypotheses. The theoretical framework, this is basically the theory that is guiding your study. My general advice is to keep it simple. Sometimes people, they think they need like more is better. So they go, 2, 3, 4 theories. I advise against that. One well-suited theory is typically best. I mean, if you need to use more than one, say 2 theories, there should be a good reason for having to do that. So they help guide your study. They also help explain your results. Now there are some questions sometimes on school guidelines. We'll see theoretical framework or conceptual framework, and really the difference, I mean, is really academic in the sense that there's not a whole lot of difference. The major difference is that theoretical frameworks are typically associated with quantitative studies. Conceptual frameworks are typically associated with qualitative studies. Don't ask me why that is so. There may be a good reason, but if it is, I don't know that it's worth even knowing. But just think of them that way. Theoretical goes with quant, conceptual goes with qual. But the important thing to do for the theoretical or conceptual framework is at the very outset, state the theory that you will be using for the framework. Define it, including any components that it includes. Obviously anchor that with citations from who developed it. Talk a little bit about what researchers have used the theory for. What have they used it to explain? Why was it developed? What was it developed to understand and to explain? And how will it connect? How does it connect to your study? How will it help explain your results? Again, this is another place where you may kind of grasp that conceptually, but when you go to write it, you may be a little challenged. So it's another place where it's helpful to have a sample from your school to look at. Another point about the theoretical framework. If you were doing a quantitative study, and let's say you're measuring transformational leadership or something, you want to use, now there are several instruments for measuring transformational leadership. Whatever instrument that you use, you want to use the associated theory. Okay, so if there's there's 2 or 3 different instruments to measure transformational leadership. They measure slightly different components. They have slightly different theoretical basis. So whatever, if you're using, say, Smith's instrument for transformational leadership, you want to use the theory of transformational leadership that was developed by Smith. So you don't want to use an instrument from one theorist and use the theory from another theorist. you want those two things to align. Nature of the study, again, this is a methodological section. We're not going to go into in any depth here, but basically it's a rationale for the selection of your design. It summarizes the methodology, including where you're going to get the data, how the data is going to be collected, how will the data be analyzed. Again, study this component can be covered more in depth in methodological webinars. And of course, the methodology is much more, this is kind of a preview of an overview in chapter 1. The methodology is worked out in more depth in chapter 3. Definition section, there's usually a section that requires you to define the variables and the concepts and the ideas in your study, the major ones. It's important to point out that these definitions, they're not discussions. They're just concise, clear definitions of your variables or your factors or your major concepts as you will be using them in your study. So you don't need to go on about them. You don't need to say, this, the definition of this factor is contested, or, people have different viewpoints. Just how you're using it in your study. In fact, you can usually get away with one sentence, maybe two. If you're studying attrition in the study will refer to, and you give the definition, and you want to give a definition and support it with an academic peer-reviewed source. No dictionary definitions, because they're not general definitions. They're specific to how you're going to use the term in your study. Okay, that's basically it for definitions. Okay, significance. This is the kind of professors like to call this the so what section. In other words, say you've decided to do this study, we don't have information on this topic or this phenomenon. That's great. So why do we need it, other than it hasn't been studied before? So the kind of approach here is two-pronged. So how is it significant, or what are the implications going to be for the research? How is it significant, or what are the implications going to be for practice? So I want you to talk a little bit about here is how might information from your study contribute to the literature, contribute to the research? It might, it depends on your study and what you're doing. It might increase our understanding of something. It might alter our understanding of a certain theory. Also, how will it affect, practitioners? How can practitioners use the information, or how might they use the information from your study? How might it affect what if you're doing a study on teaching, how might it affect administrator decisions? How might it affect what teachers do? Okay, and you really work that out more in chapter 5 when you actually get your results and you see what you actually found, and then you can make more kind of targeted recommendations for research and for practice. But at this point, it's kind of what's some of the potential significance of your study. Other sections, again, these some of these, some schools require them, some schools don't. So check your template. So I've kind of lumped them together, and they're kind of oddball sections. They're a little, sometimes they're a little difficult, but they're not long. So that's fortunate in that respect. Limitations. Limitations are any potential weaknesses or shortcomings that may affect your results. At this point, you won't know what your limitations are, but the idea is to kind of anticipate what some limitations might be, and to discuss ways that you're going to handle them if they occur. For like quantitative studies, for quantitative studies, sometimes like low sample size will be a limitation. Like if you anticipate maybe not getting enough people for some reason. I mean, I know COVID is kind of complicated data collection. But sometimes you can use alternative routes. Assumptions, it's usually a good idea to kind of start this section with a definition of assumptions, study assumptions, and anchor it with a source. That gives you some content and a place to start, but it also helps you to understand what assumptions are. These are things that must be assumed for the research to exist that you don't have control over. Like, for example, you have to assume that participants are going to answer their questions honestly and openly. I mean, you don't have control over that, so you just have to assume that that's going to happen. And you can help, you can say you can help encourage them, if, for lack of a better word, to answer them honestly by ensuring them the confidentiality of the data, their anonymity. Those things will help participants feel comfortable to answer honestly. Scope, the section's also sometimes called delimitations, which is a little confusing. And really this is just the kind of the boundaries of your study, what it includes, what it doesn't include. And so in a lot of ways, it sounds kind of like the purpose in some ways. You know, here's what your design is, here's what your approach is, here's what it will focus on. Kind of the boundaries or the delimitations of your study. It might also address any potential generalizability issues of the results. In other words, the likelihood that your results will generalize to the larger target population. And usually for quantitative studies that are going to have an adequate sample size, usually generalizability is pretty good. For qualitative studies, generalizability is low, and that's an accepted kind of delimitation or limitation of the study because the sample size needs to be low so you can get that in-depth information that you can't with quantitative studies. Okay, and the summary, and like any summary, recap major points of the chapter, remind the reader of the research problem and why your study is needed, and you can end by transitioning to the next chapter. Here's our contact information if you want to ask about additional support. And again, everybody will be sent a copy of the presentation, including the slides and the developable component as well. So let me turn to the questions now and read these out. I hope the problem with some people not being able to hear was rectified. Will you share the PowerPoint? I asked that, answered that one already. Okay. Do we have to explain why we use that specific instrument? Yeah, that's more of a methods question. You definitely need to in the methods section, nature of the study, discuss the instruments that you'll be using. If you do have to explain it, I think it can be brief. You know, maybe because it's a well-tested, well-validated, often used instrument, or because for what you're studying, it is, you know, it is particularly suited and designed to study the specific variables that you're studying. So yeah, you do need to explain it to some degree, but I think it can be pretty concise. Okay, let's see. I think that may be all the questions for now. Are there any other questions? Transformational, let's see, here's a question. Transformational leadership is a pre-qualifier to participate in my study. So I will be using the MLQ questionnaire to determine if they are transformational leaders. However, the theoretical framework is based on a different theory. Is that okay? If you were looking at transformational leadership, it seems like you would need a theory of transformational leadership, or if you're using the MLQ, theories of transformational leadership, transactional leadership, and laissez-faire leadership, which I believe are the other two kinds of leadership that the MLQ studies. So you would definitely need a leadership theory, or theory that focuses on types of leadership, including that. Yeah, so the instrument and the theoretical framework should match up as closely as possible. Here's a question: will we write what methods we would be adopting in the introduction? Yes. Is a section nature of the study or study design. There are sections in chapter 1 typically on the methodology. So yeah, you will be identifying your methodology and talking some about it, including the things I've listed here, the rationale for why you're selecting the design, why it's appropriate for your study. You're going to have to summarize the methodology, including who you're collecting the data from, how you're collecting it, how it's going to be analyzed. So yeah, you do need material in the introduction on the methodology. Of course, you go into more detail in chapter 3. And again, yeah, follow your school's template if they have it. You get samples or examples when you can. I have a question here. How long should the introduction be? There's no real, and I hate to say this because it drives people crazy. There's no kind of prescribed length, unless, again, your school has some page length requirements. Sometimes schools will give suggested lengths, but I'm thinking for a typical chapter 1, anywhere from 10 to 20 pages. I have another question here. Do you have any resources or services for mixed method studies? You can check our website. I believe we probably have descriptions of mixed method studies, maybe even blogs on mixed methods. Our services, we do work with people who are conducting mixed methods studies, so we have experience helping clients in the past with that. So you can check our website to see what resources we have. If you're interested in asking about our services about it, you can schedule a consult. But yeah, we do work with mixed methods, people conducting those types of studies. Do we need to explain our, here's another question, do we need to explain our epistemological or ontological standpoints? I'm assuming from the theory or just the kind of approach. It depends. That's kind of a school thing. I've seen it included in chapter 1s. I've also seen it not included. So if you don't have guidelines, I would follow an example or a sample from your school of a previous dissertation. I would say leave them out unless someone says put them in. But again, see what your school says, or your chair. Your chair is also another great place if you have these kinds of questions and they're not answered by the school's template, or you don't have a template. Your chair is going to be one of the final arbiters about what to include and not to include. I missed the beginning. Let me see. I missed the beginning presentation. Will a copy be sent to participants, yes, you will be sent a copy of the entire presentation. I see the phone number listed. Does that take you to a specific person? Just wondering what to expect if you call the number. Yes, it takes you to a specific person or their voicemail if they're not able to answer at that time. Will there be another webinar on the literature review chapter coming up? Yes, there is, and that will be coming up on, I can give you a date here in a minute. That will be coming up on February, let me get this right, February 4th. It looks like 11 o'clock, February the 4th, for a, and that will be on our calendar on our website too. You can double check that for a webinar on ethics review. What is the cost for your service? I don't deal with the monetary aspects, so you can ask when you have your consultation. You can ask those kind of questions there. Okay, did I hit everybody's? Do you have to explain why we use that specific instrument? I think I covered that one. I've registered for several webinars and have already completed my third, which is the one, and I have yet to receive a copy and link to the previous webinars. Melissa, you want to respond to that to Robert?
Yep. I'm responding.
Okay. Okay, Robert, Melissa's going to respond to you about that. Okay, any other questions before I go? All right, well, thank you everybody for attending, and just keep an eye on our calendar to see what we're going to be offering in the future, and good luck and be well. Bye-bye.